Thank you very much. And by the way, 𝗍𝗂𝗂𝘀𝗀𝘀 Ahmed was a fellow graduate student with me as well, in terms of the good old days. Let me begin with general comments, just three brief ones, and then I'll get to my presentation. And I would ask whoever is moderating to please let me know when my time is up. I will try to stay within a 15-minute period, but feel free to just cut in and let me know. Western powers need to rethink and reassess their policies domestically and internationally towards mainstream Muslims. I will refer to this later on in terms of attitudes with regard to the support of authoritarian regimes, and certainly issues with regard to Islamophobia, or more recently, when we look at the situation in Israel and Palestine. I certainly think that the Biden administration, I have great respect for President Biden, but the Biden administration's, amidst all the good policies he has, the policy thus far with regard to the Middle East is wanting. Both he and the Secretary of State seem to not really, in the statements that they make, look at the realities of what is happening. The idea that the United States would therefore have a Secretary of State who would not be speaking directly to the leader of Hamas, but rather be speaking to the president of the authority, who actually lost the vote to Hamas many years ago, is really very disturbing. There was a report today, which I cannot completely verify, but it was in The Guardian, which mentioned that 550 Biden staff people basically issued a statement which indicated in many ways that they would like to see a more balanced approach. We seem to still be starting with Israel, and rather than seeing this as an even playing field. And so, for example, one constantly, even in Times media, will say that Hamas is firing missiles, as if that's what started the whole thing, rather than looking at what happened in East Jerusalem, the police basically going into Al-Aqsa, the attempt to in the Abjara area to seize properties, and then the back and forth. But it acts as if every time Hamas is simply sending missiles without saying that, in fact, what's also happening every time Israel is bombing indiscriminately, as the international community has noted. With regard to Muslim governments that rely upon authoritarian rule, and sadly there are and continue to be too many of them, and rely on their security forces rather than elections and repression, well, they'll have to open up their political systems if we're really going to move forward. That is, if the region is going to move forward, but also if Muslim-West relations move forward. They will have to open up their systems, build and strengthen civil society. In many contexts, there is not a strong civil society. Discriminate between free speech and mainstream opposition, and violent extremism, on the other hand, that must be crushed and contained. But societies that limit freedom of thought and expression produce a sense of alienation and powerlessness that often results in radicalization and extremism. Let me move to my comments with regard to Islamophobia. And this is a project that I've spent a lot of my life on. And I would just say to those that are watching, there's lots of information if you go to bridge.georgetown.edu, bridge.georgetown.edu. We have about 1.1 million followers on that site, and you'll find all kinds of factual information, reports every day, etc. Muslims are integrated into many European countries successfully, into others not so successfully. And even in those countries where they're integrated and integrated well, such as the United States, the UK, Germany, France, they have to face the realities of Islamophobia. In some cases, more recently, as I'll discuss, it's not only an anti-Muslim attitude coming from the far right, but also from, for example, Mr. Macron in France. So we see growing anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant politics and racism, and the rise of the far right occurring in the West. Islamophobia has grown incrementally, influenced by the Iranian Revolution, 9/11, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and their violence and terror in the Muslim world and globally. Major polling reports began to note as early as 2015 that Islamophobia had become normalized. That is, major polling by Media Tenor and others looking at mass media, social media, saw that it had become normalized, and normalized in media, normalized in politics. The far right, but also increasingly mainstream political parties and politics, as I will be talking about with regard to France, Austria, and Germany. And in mass and especially social media, and sadly, among some religious leaders. Baroness 𝗟̀cie of the UK's House of Lords commented a number of years ago that Islamophobia had become acceptable dinner conversation. And more recently, she's been critical of the UK Conservative Party for not addressing Islamophobia within its ranks. The US has seen most recently in Donald Trump's presidency a major problem with regard to officially the US and dealing with both Muslims domestically and internationally. As a candidate, President Trump, as a candidate, said Islam hates us. And when pressed on it, said, well, there are many of them. But he stuck to that phrase, Islam hates us, and then, as you know, instituted a Muslim ban. And many members of his administration, including Secretary of State Pompeo, have a long track record in being, in terms of their statements, and also being associated with groups like Act for America, which is a very vibrant anti-Muslim organization. In America, for example, we have found, and it also exists and is influential in Europe, an organized and well-funded Islamophobic international network. For example, in the US, CARE and the University of California at Berkeley Center, in their 2016 report, Confronting Fear, noted that between 2008 and 2013, $205,838,000 went to Islamophobic writers, Islamophobic organizations, and social media. And there's a kind of cross-pollination and international connections, which you can see, for example, when you look at the Norwegian and New Zealand terrorists, and they're citing American and other European Islamophobes and their writings. Islamophobia today, to just look at 3 examples. Major politicians in France, Austria, and Germany have framed political Islam, Islamist separatism, or they've used the phrase Islamism as the greatest threat to European society, calling it a poison that has to be extinguished. This phrase political Islam is used in general more recently by these governments, and they don't make the distinction between political Islam, talking about mainstream involvement of Islamic political parties and organizations. That would be part of political Islam, but rather political Islam is simply a negative thing. If Muslims are framed as carriers of a poison, every measure can be taken as an antidote to protect oneself. This attitude allows political leaders to justify drastic political measures against an allegedly dangerous group of people, but often it's actually Muslim civil society that's being impacted. Thus, we have seen police and security raids against Muslim civil society, mosque organizations, and scholars in France, Austria, and Germany in the name of protecting the state and its constitution. However, the result is that values such as freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech and thought, enshrined in their constitutions, are undermined. The net result of this xenophobic, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigrant far-right extremism, which we see, can be seen in the rhetoric, policies, and significant election performance of far-right political parties across Europe. Mr. Macron, who is not part of the far-right, but is leaning into their very position as he looks to future elections in order to broaden his base of support. In France, in response to the brutal murder of a secondary school teacher by a Chechen immigrant, French Interior Minister called for swift government measures against the enemy within, referring to France's Muslim community. Under the banner of protecting the state from Islamic terrorism, French authorities launched a crackdown, not just on extremists and terrorists, but also on the country's near 6 million Muslims. The government carried out raids targeting Muslim civil society, marking 231 people for deportation, arresting dozens of others, and classifying more than 50 Muslim associations for dissolution. One of the organizations French authorities identified for dissolution is an NGO, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, an advocacy organization that documents hate crimes against Muslims. The organization had noted rising anti-Muslim sentiment in France and found that in 2019, there were nearly 800 anti-Muslim acts, a 77% increase. Yet France's interior minister, with no proof, called the organization an enemy of the Republic. Macron has campaigned for his policy of Islamist separatism, talking about that, but often again defining it, but not defining it clearly, and an application brushstroking mainstream Muslims as a law and order issue, claiming that government measures were needed to fight against political Islam. The French and Austrian governments, like far-right Islamophobic writers and organizations, frame critical scholarship and polls and facts as responsible for creating and promoting a dangerous social divide. Islamophobia is portrayed as a combative term, a weapon. Frame the discussion against Islamophobia as a weapon used to silence criticism of Islam and Muslims. They charge that anti-Islamophobe, anti-racists have in fact become racist themselves and call for defending the state against the erosion of their Western values. The Islamophobic discourse is also used by other European governments and politicians to silence criticism of their assimilationist policies or lack of, and policies towards immigrants and working class Muslim populations. In Austria, we've seen an attack against Muslim civil society, similar to Macron's policy to crack down on Muslim civil society. On November 11th, 2020, 930 Austrian police stormed 60 homes throughout Austria, in Austria's largest police raid operation since 1945. The most recent examples of the dangerous results and fallout from this culture war is the raid against these alleged terrorists that took place, as I said, on November 20th. They argued that the raid had aimed at cutting off the roots of political Islam. When the defendants accused of a terrorist organization and terrorism finance were interrogated following the raids, they were asked questions that had little to do with violence and militancy, but a lot to do with an Orientalist perspective on Islam, being Muslim and having political views. They asked the following questions. What do you understand by the term Islamophobia? In your opinion, is this term justified? If so, please explain why. And what do you understand by the term? Are Muslims suppressed in Austria? Is Islamist global terrorism possibly the reason for fears emanating from Islam? Or is it the oppression, especially of women or people of other faiths, by the norms of the Sharia? Do you wake up your wife for prayer in the morning? Are your kids allowed to play music? Do you have non-Muslim friends? Is your daughter allowed to marry a Christian, Jew, or atheist? Despite these allegations, not a single person has been indicted. Yet the problem is that under Austrian law, these people are still, for the next 2 or 3 years, at any point, the government could indict them. In the meantime, they have frozen their bank accounts, affected their jobs, etc. I'm going to skip Germany because of time. The West and its conventional framework and policies is the next topic I'd like to address. The challenge for American and European policymakers remains to replace the conventional framework that relies on heavily supported authoritarian regimes, their military, their security forces, to ensure stability through security. We saw this in the ambivalent approach to the Arab Spring, and then accepting what happened with the elections in Egypt, but then later accepting the coup and what's happened subsequently in terms of foreign aid, etc. We need to move beyond the past and current policy that equates protection of Western national interests with the stability and security of authoritarian regimes. Policy driven more by fear of the unknown, often particularly of Islamic movements and parties, or called political Islam, is a process whose outcome one cannot control. And it tends to undermine principles of self-determination, democracy, and human rights. Major polling by Gallup and other organizations show that a policy of uncritical support, while attractive to authoritarian allies and their entrenched elites, feeds anti-Americanism in particular, but also anti-European allies like the UK and France, and fears of Western intervention, invasion, occupation, and dependency. There's a need for a new narrative that goes beyond a Cold War approach and the policy of democratic exceptionalism, as even President George W. Bush acknowledged that the US under presidents, including in his first term, and he wanted to correct this, he said, practiced a policy of democratic exceptionalism in the Middle East. I referred to the failure of the Arab Spring, and we can discuss that down the line. I'll just end with a couple of comments. Western governments need to think about changing their approach as well as the way that they've moved forward. The US and Europe should work with and use diplomacy, their political, economic, and military leverage to pressure Muslim authoritarian allies, to work with them in the, but also to pressure them to broaden political participation. In some places, it doesn't exist at all. Develop independent government institutions and strong civil societies that limit corruption and increase respect for human rights. Western governments provide substantial aid for economic and educational development very often. They need to cut back, on the other hand, on substantially on arms sales and such high-profile symbols as oversized embassies, military bases, ships, and troops, all of which emphasize American and European armed presence and the tangible threat of dependency, intervention, and domination. If authoritarian Muslim governments and societies are to change through evolution, not revolution, rulers must become more accountable to their people and governments, more independent and pragmatic in their relations with the West. They reflect better the interests, desires, and values of their people. And let me end with this. Greater democratization will not need necessarily to lead to wholesale secularization. The idea of modernization and secularization theory that modern states had to be democratic and adapt Western models of development is exaggerated. Today, there are many of us who talk about multiple modernities. There can be a synthesis of greater freedom and the recognition of religious values included within societies. And I hope in the question and answer period, we'll get into Israel and Palestine. I'm going to end there because I think I'm overstaying my time. Thank you very much.